Greetings, YouTubers. Welcome back to Shondo RC. I know it's been a while since I've posted any videos, but I've been kind of playing around with new hobbies and testing these radios so I could do a video. Kind of got into recently doing some 3D printing, so I 3D printed an airplane and tried it out with the new access protocol receiver that, of course, had to update the firmware myself in that receiver to get it to accept access, which is kind of irritating. But I want to talk a little bit about these two radios. I've had some people ask me some questions. Somebody asked me recently concerning the access, did I know anything about it? No, I really don't. But I will talk about my personal experience in using it recently, and as well as some of the questions that's come out concerning the Jumper T16, which is supposed to be the rival of the FrSky radio. I don't think it's a rival at all. I think it's a good radio, especially after doing some testing in the field with it myself. I think it's a very good radio, but I don't think it's a rival by any means. It's no secret that I'm a big fan of FrSky, and you guys pretty much know what I think about Spectrum. I don't really think very highly of Spectrum at all. I think it's an inferior radio system. Spectrum is. It's prone to a lot of interference, blackouts, all kinds of weird things and stuff that, Horizon and everybody else won't talk about, of course, but those of us that are out there in precarious situation type fields where we have a lot of interference, you'll know very quickly that Spectrum is not the radio system that you want in your aircraft. So when it comes to FrSky, the reason I use FrSky is not because of their radio. I like the radios, but I use the FrSky because of the protocol, which is the actual communication link between radio and receiver. It's rock solid. It's not prone to very much interference. It's just, especially where we fly out of, it's a fantastic system to use out there, and it keeps your aircraft much more safer than using some of the other radio systems out there. There's other good ones out there too, but and Spectrum may have gotten better, over the past few years. I don't know. I'm just still kind of spooked after we lost over $5,000 worth of aircrafts in a single month out there at our flying field, all due to Spectrum. So I'm kind of spooked, and I don't really want to fly the stuff right now. And and that even involved their DSMX protocol. So I don't really have a whole lot good to say about them right now. But what I am interested in showing you today is the T16. I had pretty good luck with the T16 when I purchased it. I've done some research on the original version of the T16. This is the second version that just came out, the Pro, with the Hall effect gimbals. The first version didn't have Hall effect gimbals. It used the old potentiometer style gimbals, and if you know anything about those, they're not very good. They do wear out because they're mechanical gimbals. So they do wear out from time to time. If you use your radio a lot and you're using potentiometer style gimbals, you're probably going to wear out a gimbal or two within the first year or 2 years for sure. Hall effect sensor style gimbals aren't mechanical. They use a sensor, so they're going to last a lot longer, give you a lot less issues. But that's one of the great upgrades that they did with the Jumper T16 this time around. As well as putting an internal module in it instead of using an external module. You see the antenna here? It didn't used to have that. What they used to use is they utilized just this regular bay back here. They gave you kind of an empty box with no internal module, and they gave you the JR style bay in the back where you could plug in a multi-module and fly pretty much anything you wanted. Now they give you an internal module that is also a multi-module that pretty much allows you to fly just about everything out there, from FrSky to Spectrum to some of the Futaba or whatever it may be. There's a whole host of them, so to speak. And I did tests with two different frequencies within the past 2 weeks with this radio. I used FrSky, and I also tested it with Spectrum, and both tested very well. And I'm going to tell you what I found concerning that. But let's go over here to the access real quick, because that was the first question that was asked to me, is what do I think about the access? I don't think negatively or positively, concerning it. It's got its pluses and minuses, and some of the pluses that's out there are kind of irrelevant to what I'm going to use. We're just out there flying our airplanes day to day, and some of the stuff that the access will allow you to do concerning like being able to bind two radios to one receiver in case you want your friend to fly your airplane or whatever. That's all irrelevant. I don't really care about that kind of stuff. I will tell you this. One thing they do boast about is being able to wirelessly bind your airplane to your radio. Wirelessly. And for some of you out there that has bound some of these FrSky receivers, you know how convenient that can be. Pushing that button and plugging that power inside that airplane can kind of be a pain in the rump sometimes, especially when well, basically what I'm trying to say is it takes 3 or 4 hands to do that sometimes. And they boast about being able to bind your radio to that receiver wirelessly now without having to do that. However, you've got to register the receiver to the radio first before you can wirelessly bind it. And how do you register it? Well, the same way that's been irritating you for years. You have to push the button and apply power to the receiver to get it to register. So it's basically binding it with a different name. So now you not only do you got to bind it that way to register it, but then you've got to register it wirelessly once you get it ready to go. So it's basically an extra step process, and I just think it's unnecessary. Another thing too concerning the radio is they've the backward compatibility. A lot of people were concerned about backward compatibility with FrSky because when they first came out with the access radios, it was access only, and it wasn't backward compatible with some of your older receivers like your X series or your D series or whatever it may be. Well, they've made this backward compatible. The new version is anyway. This is the Taranis Plus 2019 version SE. And the reason I go with SE, what's the difference? Mostly the screw-on antenna. It screws onto the top of the radio. Any of you that's owned some of the older Taranis radios understand that the antenna on that radio is the Achilles heel of that radio. It's a fixed antenna. It doesn't come off, and it always seems to break where the antenna bends. And it's a real pain in the rear to go ahead and change that antenna too when it does break, because it's hard soldered to the module inside the radio. So you've got to be extremely good at soldering to be able to get that thing on there, or you're going to send that radio off to a loft, and they're going to have to do it for you, which is a big hassle. But the SE version, the special edition, has the screw-on antenna, which I really like, because if I break the antenna, I can take it off, screw another antenna on there, and I'm off and flying. I don't have to wait 2 weeks to get the radio back. So that's a big plus, concerning that. Another thing concerning the access protocol, and I did fly it on a flying wing that I 3D printed, and I put the firmware in a specific receiver. I flew it with the access. I noticed no difference whatsoever concerning access in the X series receivers that I've been flying for a few years now. They talk about latency. The latency being much better in the new access protocol compared to the X or the ACCST. You're not going to notice that. I don't know what they're trying to sell there, telling you, oh, the latency is this or that or whatever. You're not going to notice it. Everyday flyer out there that's going to go out and fly as park flyers or as regular airplanes and stuff is not going to notice that little bit of change in that latency. So don't be entirely sold on that. I don't know what's going on or why they came out with the access. I have my opinions of why they've done so, but I don't think it has anything to do with jumper. FrSky builds probably one of the best radio systems out there, and I'm not talking about the radio. I'm talking about the protocol that they use between radio and receiver. It's fantastic, rock solid, like I've already mentioned, and you really can't go wrong with it. And it's long range. Some of their regular range receivers are still long range compared to everybody else's. It's a very good system. So don't be sold on that. I think another thing that kind of irritates me concerning that new protocol is this. All of the receivers out there, or most of the receivers out there, and probably a very large number of receivers that most of you already have in your aircraft, is not going to be compatible with access. Like the old X8Rs, remember those receivers? Well, I've got like 21 of those in my airplanes. And none of those have any firmware available to be able to upgrade it to access. So I can't upgrade it to access, which probably means sometime in the future, when they start discontinuing the old protocol, the ACCST, and they will, that my receivers aren't going to work with future radios, probably. And that's going to make it a little irritating, because that means then I'm going to have to buy new receivers And hopefully by then they'll have receivers out that have a access already built into it, and you don't have to upload the firmware yourself, because that's another whole hassle. And for guys like me, it's easy because I do this kind of stuff every day. But for the layman, for the guy that's getting into RC or has only been in it for a year, all this computer mumbo jumbo of flashing firmware and doing this and doing that is, well, it's kind of a headache, and it's kind of confusing, and it's discouraging. So hopefully one day these companies like FrSky and even OpenTX, operating systems on both radios, that you get your head out of the clouds and start realizing that there's people out there that's flying airplanes that are not rocket scientists. So, and part of the reason I made this channel was to try to put things in layman's terms so people could better understand how to do things with these radios. When I first got into OpenTX, it was extremely confusing. It still is if you go out and Google some of the stuff you need to do. When you go on the forums and you're listening to what people have to say and how they explain to you what needs to be done to obtain what you're trying to obtain, they're assuming that they're talking to rocket scientists, somebody who already knows. And you know what? We don't know. We need it put in layman's terms so we can better understand what you're trying to do here, so we can understand how to get our radios working. So that's part of the reason I came up with this channel, was to try to explain things the best way that I could so that you could understand it, so you didn't have to go through the same 3 years of struggling that I did when I first got into OpenTX. And it would behoove them to do that, to start focusing on that market as well, with the new flyers and the guys that's only been in it, for a short period of time, to start gearing things towards that angle, because that's things that Spectrum is very good at, is coming out with systems that are very easy to use for guys that really have never used anything before. And if OpenTX and FrSky could come up with something like that, or even Jumper or whatever, man, you'd have the market, because you've darn sure got the best protocol out there, and you do. But that's my thoughts on access. I'm not impressed. I don't really care either one way or the other. My ACCST seems to work identical to it, except for the features that I'm never going to use. It doesn't matter. But eventually we're all probably going to be forced into buying access, because they're a company that sells products, and they got to keep selling their products, so they got to get you to keep buying new products from time to time. And the way to do that is obsolete some stuff and come out with new things. Now, moving on to the Jumper T16. The first version wasn't very good, like I had explained. I'd also seen the teardown of the first version of the radio, and the components inside of it looked pretty cheesy. I mean, it was real cheap inside, and it just didn't impress me at all. It almost looked like, yeah, I don't want that. That's some pretty cheap electronics there. I don't know what the inside of this second one looks like, because I'm not going to take it apart, because it's my radio. And I just don't want to take my stuff apart. But maybe I'll find some teardown videos on it here later on somewhere, and I'll be able to look inside of it and see what it looks like. But one of the first things I noticed when I got the radio, when I pulled it out of the box, was the ergonomics. Ergonomics? Well, that means how the radio felt, how things were accessible by holding it, were things within reach. Yes, the radio feels extremely good. The gimbals feel very good. They don't feel cheap and like plasticky like some of the cheap radios out there. The switches feel identical to the switches on the Tyrannus. Probably the same company making them, who knows, and they know it's a very common switch that's in the Tyrannus. You find it in a lot of radios. It also is now supported by OpenTX. OpenTX now supports the Jumper T16. Here's what's kind of strange about it is the Horus, the X10S radio that runs the OpenTX. It's the exact same operating system that's in the T16. So if you own a Horus X10S, it's identical. I mean, when you turn the screen on, it looks identical. Here, check this out. I'll turn it on. One of the things you'll notice is the cheap speaker. It's got a real cheesy speaker in this thing, so I'm not real impressed with the speaker. I didn't like it, but let's see. But you can see right there, it looks just like the Horus OpenTX operating system. It's identical to it. No different. The reason I know that is because if you look at some of my videos, most of my videos are done using the X10S, and it's all the same screens. Works the exact same way. I was always kind of leery about using any of the radios that had the multi-modules in them, because it seems to me that if they're going to cram all those protocols in a specific module, if there's going to be that much space taken up in a module for multiple protocols, well, then they've got to be sacrificing something. But in my testing, I really didn't see anything that they did sacrifice. Let's go over a little bit of that and what we did and what we found when we had it out there. When you buy this radio, first of all, this thing came shipped to me. I got it in about 3 days. I paid for the radio and the two cheesy 18650 batteries they sell you separately. I don't know why radio manufacturers are selling radios now with no batteries in them, but separately and shipped was about $190 for everything. That's the two batteries, the radio, and the shipping. You can get an FrSky radio for about $110. You can get an X or a QX7 for $110. It's a 16-channel radio. It still runs OpenTX on it. And you can buy a $20 multi-module or a $25 multi-module to go in the back of it and probably do everything too. Although I have been told, which I have not researched yet to find out, that the QX7 doesn't support multi-modules, and it may not. So if it doesn't, you might have to go a step up, and get you a Tyrannus or something. But with that said, the batteries that you order separately with it are garbage. These are 18650 lithium-ion 6000 milliamps. Well, you guess what I got? 4 flights, and I got a transmitter low battery warning. So I got 4 flights and had to charge the batteries. Then what happened? I got 3 or 4 flights again and had to charge the batteries. So instead what I did is I went and Googled around and found this battery, which is a Pulse LiPo battery. It's a 3000 milliamp. I think the resistance in these are a little high though, so I wasn't real impressed with that. Don't know how long the battery will last, but I did order one of these. It was kind of cheap. It was like $11 or something. Or you can just go get your own 2S 7.4 volt LiPo transmitter battery and pop it in there yourself. It doesn't matter. But the LiPo battery, I got 2 weekends. Okay, so it's over a dozen flights and still had battery left in that. So the LiPo does way better than these things. So don't buy these if you buy the Jumper T16. Get you a LiPo. Get it from somewhere else. But once I got the battery stuff figured out, I was ready to go. But I had, like I said, did a couple of tests with the T16 and was pretty impressed. And like I said, the multi-module will handle several protocols. It does not do the Access FrSky, but it will do the X series FrSky. And it does many other protocols as well. So that's handy if you're going to go out and you buy some of these bind and fly Horizon Hobby Spectrum airplanes. Well, that radio is going to work with it just fine. You're going to be able to bind to it. And what I like about OpenTX, and if any of you have been using the OpenTX for any amount of time, it's highly customizable. It's going to be able to do more things than anything Spectrum has ever come out with because it's OpenTX. The sky's pretty much the limit with those things. So it doesn't handle the access protocol, but it handles pretty much anything else. A negative. Channel mapping. Here's what's important to understand. The radio comes out of the box with a channel mapping of aileron, elevator, throttle, rudder. In other words, channel 1 is going to be aileron, channel 2 is going to be elevator, 3 is throttle, and 4 is rudder. Well, that does create an issue with the Spectrum components. Your Spectrum components are always channel 1 throttle, then it goes aileron, elevator, rudder. They're TAER is the channel mapping in a Spectrum. So keep that in mind when you get this radio, that the mapping is going to be different, and it's going to create all kinds of issues when you bind up to a Spectrum. And I know that because I did that. I had a heck of a time getting everything to work. Everything was completely out of where it's supposed to be, and it was a lot harder to set up than you think. And you think, well, no, I can just move this servo to that slot and this one to that slot. Well, yeah, you can, and you can get the plane working that way, but it screws with fail-safes. So when you go to set up fail-safes, it creates an issue. They don't set up properly. So the good news is there is firmware for the internal module. You can change the firmware. You can go to a website. You'd have to Google it because it was one of those things that was almost impossible to find. Again, like I'm talking about this open source stuff. It's fantastic. You can do anything with it, but they expect you to be a rocket scientist concerning it. And for somebody that's never done it before, it's impossible to get some of the information you need out there online because they're just not explaining it well enough. But if I need to do some videos in the future to show you how to do some of that stuff, I'll be glad to do it. Just post some requests on there. I'll build something, put something together, and show you how to do that kind of stuff. It's no big deal. But I did find the firmware, and they do have the internal module firmware for this radio. You do have to flash it based on your channel mapping orders. So I'm used to using the old Spectrum style channel mapping, which is, like I said, throttle, aileron, elevator, rudder, in that order. I'm used to that because when I first started in the hobby, I was flying Spectrum. When I moved to FrSky, I mapped everything the same way. And when I got the T16, I went ahead and I got the firmware for the module. That was throttle, aileron, elevator, rudder, because you can flash it with any channel mapping you want. And once you do that, it fixes all your mapping issues and your fail-safes will work when you set them up. No problem at all. So make sure you do that. Also, if you're going to recently, or if you have recently bought a T16, make absolutely sure you update the OpenTX in it. There is a critical update for the OpenTX. They're recommending that anybody that buys the radio or has the radio, the new version with the Pro, get it updated because it addresses some serious issues that's in that firmware. It'll get it taken care of for you. But like I said, let me move on to something else here. I'll tell you about the range tests I did on this. Last weekend I took it out and I tested the FrSky range test. Let me show you something about FrSky when you set up FrSky in this radio. Something important to know. You got to turn on the internal module. When you turn on the internal module, it'll be set to whatever it comes up with first, but it comes up as a multi because that's what it is. Then you scroll over here and you select your protocol. Now I'm using FrSky D16. Now what I want to show you down here is down here they have bind and range test. Okay, great. They also have what they call RF frequency fine tune. And they give you the RSSI values next to it if you look over here on the right hand side. See the RSSI? Okay, fine tune. It's set to 0 by default. Now what goes on with FrSky is this. What they want you to do is they want you to set the airplane several feet away to fine tune your signal strength to that airplane. So they want you to set it several feet away and they want you to move this number to the negative until you lose signal. Write that number down. Then you're going to move it to the positive till you lose signal. And you write that number down. Then you calculate it with your calculator to find out what the number in between is, right in the middle. And that's where you want to set it at. Okay, that gives you the optimal signal strength to be able to communicate from radio to receiver and get the strongest signal that you can get, from your radio to your airplane. So that's what they want you to do. They kind of want you to, set the signal strength with the This is only for the FrSky. The other radios protocols aren't doing that, but they're recommending that with FrSky. Now, when I went out and tested it, I left it at the default range of 0 and had no issues. Other receivers may have an issue. I don't know. But let's get on to the range testing out of the box. I used a D8RXP. Yes, that's right. An old D series receiver because that's what happened to be in the plane when I was testing it, and they work very well. But I used a D8RXP receiver from FrSky, and I did a range test. Now, when I did the range test, I got 150 plus paces away from the aircraft before I got a low RSSI warning. And that was a low warning. That wasn't a total loss. That was just a low warning. I couldn't walk any farther than that because I was at the woods. So there was nowhere I could go but in the woods, and I didn't do it. I thought 150, holy cow, that's great to begin with. I mean, that's FrSky for you. They got fantastic range. So then in flight, I had no issues whatsoever. It responded well to all inputs, so everything was fantastic. So it flew almost completely out of line of sight. We had 3 people watching the aircraft to make sure that it was in the air and that we could all barely determine what the orientation of the aircraft was. That's how far we were flying it away, and had no issues and was able to bring it back. And we flew 8-minute flights, each time with these aircrafts and had no issues. Flew it for a weekend like that. No problems whatsoever. Brought it back, decided to check and test with a Spectrum. And what we used with Spectrum is we set the protocol up to Spectrum. You can either use DSM2 or DSMX. And when you use DSMX, it will automatically search its own protocol and determine whether it's going to be 11 or 22 milliseconds. It doesn't matter, whatever. Let it search its own thing on the X series, and it'll pick it up, it'll bind, and it'll go with it. It binds the same way. It doesn't bind like a Spectrum radio, but you'll also bind a Spectrum just like you bind a FrSky. You know, you get the receiver powered up in bind mode, you turn the radio on, you scroll to bind, you hit enter, and it will bind it. It's not a matter of turning the radio in while holding a button like it is on the Spectrum radios. You bind it just like you would any other OpenTX thing. But we use the AR620 Sport receiver, which I thought was kind of cool. I had one laying around here from an airplane I bought and decided not to use it because I'm not a Spectrum guy, but they're antennaless. They have no antennas sticking out of them, which I think is a fantastic idea. I think everybody else needs to jump on board with that and develop that as well, because it takes up less space in the aircraft. You don't have to worry about routing antennas, keeping them out of way of servos or whatever. You just put that sucker in there, plug it in, and go, and it worked perfectly. But we went off and we did a range test on that. Spectrum, now keep in mind, you know, back in the day, they always told you if you got 30 to 40 paces away from the airplane when you're range testing, it's safe to fly. It's got a good range, you're good to go. So if you get 150 on the FrSky, then you know you're really good to go. You've got a fantastic range. But here's what was impressive, and I don't know if this has to do with the Spectrum protocol these days, because I don't know, I haven't been flying it. But I was able to walk off 90 paces with this radio. 90 paces with the Spectrum before I lost total loss of signal and had to walk back to the aircraft. That's still pretty impressive. I remember the old days of my Spectrums. I think the best I got, which was on one of the 7-channel Spectrum radios, the best I got was 60 paces. So I got 90 on this before I had any issues, which is still fantastic. You're not going to have any issues when it concerns, you know, distance with that. So flying it flew very well under normal flying circumstances. However, when I tried to fly it out to the distances that I flew the FrSky, I did have an issue twice. I had a blackout twice, was still able to regain control of the aircraft, thank God, and bring it back. But, you know, that's not something I'm blaming on Spectrum. That's something you got to understand. I was pushing this thing to the limits, probably flying it way farther than what was recommended for that little receiver. And it was still very impressive. So I was pretty impressed with how that handled. So just keep in mind that, you know, if you're going to fly any kind of radio system with this T16, please range check it first. I don't know how every one of them is going to respond. I don't have everybody's receivers out there to be able to test them all, or I would gladly do it. But doing the FrSky and doing the Spectrum, it was pretty darn impressive. Not bad. Not a bad little radio at all. I mean, everything seems pretty cool. I like the radio. I mean, the radio looks like a, to me it looks like, and you can Google it yourself, but check out the old, not the old, but the Futaba 16 channel. It looks just like it. These little silver buttons are identical. They've got the pot switches or the pot knobs in the same spots. I mean, it looks the same. The radio's nice. It's not overly heavy. The Horus I didn't like, and that's why you see this one here now, because I went back to the Taranis, because Taranis has always been my favorite radio, and it has. I just like the radio. I like the way it feels. It just fits me perfectly. So I went back to that, and I sold the Horus X10S because I didn't like it. It was like holding a cinder block. But this one is not like that. This one is nice and light. Everything's kind of closer together. Everything feels good. Very impressive. Don't know how long it'll hold up. Only time will tell. But we'll see how it goes. Talk to you about the antennas a little bit here. If you look at the Taranis antennas, bigger than the T16 antenna, almost by an inch. A lot of people look at that little stubby antenna on that T16 and they think, well, I'm going to throw me a 5 or a 6 dBm on there. Word of caution, make absolutely sure you know what you're doing before you do that. A lot of people like to change antennas because they think it increases range or whatever it may do. Yeah, it might. You don't know. Here's the issue you've got to take into consideration when you're changing antennas on any of your radios. Unfortunately, they used to have a specific thing you could look at on the radio in OpenTX that was called SWR. SWR was a reading that's on the radio that basically tells you how good your antenna is. They don't have that anymore. And then they changed it to a name called RAS. SWR stands for standing wave ratio. And they changed it to RAS, which is relative antenna status. That's what RAS stands for. Used to be a rating you could go to in the analytics page of your radio, and you could look at the RAS or the SWR, whatever they had it titled as, and you would be able to determine if your antenna was healthy. And the rule of thumb is closer to 0 was better. You started getting into the higher numbers, you started getting up above 10 or something like that. You needed to check your antenna to see if you had an issue with the antenna or if it was the wrong antenna. SWR, what it is the standing wave ratio. That's determined by how much power is going out of that antenna versus what's coming back in. In other words, is this. If it can't push all of the energy out of the antenna, all the remaining energy's got to be backfed back into that module. That's not good. So the higher number that you're going to see on that RAS or that SWR going back into that radio is not good for the module. Even though you're flying your airplane perfectly fine and you're getting 50% more range, keep in mind, your module could quit any second, because if you're getting too much feedback going back into that voltage feedback going back into that module, at best you're shortening the life of that module. So keep that in mind. That make absolutely sure when you put an antenna on a radio that you check that antenna first, and make absolutely sure that you've got good SWR ratings in that antenna before you stick it on there. One of the ways to do that is you can buy what they call a calibrated SWR meter. They're hard to find and they're expensive. You could get one, they get a cheaper one, they get an RC version. They don't guarantee it as being 100% accurate, but you know what, it's closer than not knowing at all. But you could get one of those and you could test your antenna with it. If you want to put a 5 dBm antenna on your radio or whatever, make sure you screw down that SWR meter to make sure that it doesn't have too high of a number. You want it, theoretically be somewhere around 0 or 1. If you're up around 10, 16 or something like that, you don't want it on your radio. And the issue with this is you could get one 5 dBm antenna that's got good SWR, and you could put another 5 dBm antenna on there that's got terrible. Depends on who's making it and how good of a quality it is. So don't play games with that kind of stuff. I've already told you that antenna gets a good range the way it sits right on the radio. Why bother unless you're going to start getting into some FPV stuff? If you're going to get into FPV stuff, then you want to at least check your antennas before you start plugging them on your radios, especially with something like a jumper, which we don't have a lot of information about yet, and we don't understand the quality of the modules that they're sticking in these things. It may not take much to blow these things up. But anyway, if you'd like to see me come out with some videos concerning this radio later on, how to set it up, how to get the firmware, how to do all that kind of stuff with this radio, just leave some messages down there. If I get enough of them, I'll go ahead and start compiling that information, and I'll make it happen for you. Other than that, I hope you like what you saw. If you did, go ahead and hit subscribe. There's going to be a lot more videos to come now that I'm not playing with my 3D printer so much anymore. And other than that, happy flying.